Margaret Wilson had always been the kind of woman who kept her secrets close to her chest. At 73 years old, she moved around her son's ranch with the quiet determination of someone who had weathered decades of hardship on the Texas plains. Her hands, weathered from years of farm work, still trembled slightly as she folded her clothes into the old leather suitcase that had traveled with her family for generations. Tom Wilson watched his mother from the kitchen window, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The ranch had been struggling for months now. Cattle prices had dropped, the drought had ruined most of their grazing land, and the bank had been sending letters that made his stomach turn every time he saw them in the mailbox. His mother had been living with him since his father passed away 2 years ago, but lately, Tom felt like he was drowning in responsibilities he couldn't handle. The conversation they'd had the night before still echoed in his mind. Tom had suggested, as gently as he could, that maybe it was time for his mother to consider moving to Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility in town. It wasn't that he didn't love her or want her around, he'd explained, but he was barely keeping the ranch afloat. He couldn't afford to hire help, and he worried constantly about her safety when he was out working the far pastures. Margaret had listened without saying much, just nodding occasionally and sipping her tea. She'd agreed. Perhaps too easily, Tom thought now. She'd simply said she understood and that she'd start making arrangements. There had been something in her eyes, though, something he couldn't quite read. Now, as he watched her pack, Tom felt a wave of guilt wash over him. His mother had sacrificed so much over the years. She'd worked alongside his father to build this ranch from nothing, had raised 3 children while managing household finances and helping with the livestock. When his 2 sisters had moved away to pursue careers in the city, it had been Margaret who stayed behind, who helped Tom learn the business when his father's health began to fail. Margaret closed the suitcase with a soft click and sat down heavily on the bed. The weight of what she was carrying wasn't just emotional, though Tom had no idea about that. Hidden beneath her carefully folded dresses and worn cardigans were stacks of bills that represented a lifetime of careful saving, planning, and sacrifice. The money had been accumulating for decades, tucked away in accounts her late husband had set up, investments made during better years, and savings bonds purchased with every spare dollar they could manage. She'd never told Tom about the money because she'd seen what sudden wealth could do to families. She'd watched neighbors tear themselves apart over inheritance disputes, had seen children become careless and entitled when they knew money was waiting for them. She and her husband had agreed years ago that the money would be their safety net, something to be revealed only when absolutely necessary. But now, watching her son struggle, seeing the stress lines deepen around his eyes and the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of responsibility, Margaret knew the time had come. She just wasn't sure how to tell him. The amount was staggering even to her. Over the years, their careful investments and savings had grown beyond what she'd ever imagined possible. Tom knocked gently on her bedroom door. When she called for him to come in, he found her sitting quietly beside her packed suitcase, her hands folded in her lap. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the window caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment, Tom was struck by how fragile she looked. They drove to Sunset Manor mostly in silence, the leather suitcase secure in the trunk behind them. Tom kept glancing at his mother, trying to think of something to say that might make this transition easier for both of them. Margaret stared out the window at the passing landscape, at the fields and farmhouses that had been her world for so many years. At the assisted living facility, the staff was kind and efficient. They showed Margaret to her room, a small but comfortable space with a window overlooking a well-maintained garden. Tom helped her unpack some of her things, hanging her dresses in the narrow closet and arranging her few personal items on the dresser. When it came time to leave, Tom hugged his mother, longer than usual. She felt smaller in his arms than he remembered, and he had to blink back tears as he promised to visit every few days. Margaret watched from her window as his pickup truck disappeared down the tree-lined drive, and only then did she allow herself to smile. The next morning, Margaret made a phone call to her longtime attorney, Harold Brennan, who had handled her family's legal affairs for over 20 years. Her voice was steady as she explained what she needed him to do. Harold Brennan had been handling the Wilson family's legal affairs since Tom was just a boy, and he thought he knew everything there was to know about their financial situation. So when Margaret called him that Tuesday morning and asked him to come to Sunset Manor to discuss some urgent business matters, he assumed she needed help with Medicare paperwork or perhaps updating her will. What he found when he arrived at her small room that afternoon was something entirely different. Margaret had spread documents across her narrow dining table like a general planning a military campaign. Bank statements, investment portfolios, savings bonds, and certificates of deposit were organized in neat piles. Harold's eyes widened as he began to scan the numbers. Margaret watched his expression change from polite professional interest to genuine shock. She'd been carefully managing these assets for decades, moving money between accounts, reinvesting dividends, and making strategic decisions that her late husband had taught her. What had started as modest savings from their early farming years had grown into something substantial through careful planning and patience. The numbers were staggering. Between various savings accounts, long-term investments, government bonds, and certificates of deposit that had been quietly compounding interest for years, Margaret Wilson had accumulated over $1.4 million. Harold had to check the statements twice to make sure he was reading them correctly. Margaret explained her plan with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss the weather. She wanted to liquidate a significant portion of these assets and arrange for the money to be transferred in a way that would help her son save the ranch. But she didn't want Tom to know where the money was coming from, at least not initially. Harold adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his chair. In his 30 years of practice, he'd seen plenty of family financial dramas, but this was something different. Margaret wasn't looking for legal loopholes or trying to hide money from the government. She simply wanted to help her son without him knowing the help was coming from her. The attorney explained the various options available to her. She could gift the money directly, though that would trigger certain tax implications. She could loan it to Tom at favorable terms. Or she could create a more complex arrangement that might provide the help he needed while maintaining her desire for anonymity. Margaret listened carefully to each option, asking thoughtful questions that revealed her deeper understanding of financial matters than most people her age possessed. She'd been quietly educating herself about investments and money management for years, reading financial magazines and consulting with advisors when necessary. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Tom was having one of the worst weeks of his life. A section of fencing had been damaged in a storm, allowing 30 head of cattle to wander onto a neighbor's property. The repair costs were mounting, and his neighbor was demanding compensation for damage to their crops. The bank had called twice that week, and Tom knew they were running out of patience. The mortgage payments were 3 months behind, and despite his best efforts to negotiate new terms, the bank manager had made it clear that foreclosure proceedings would begin soon if the situation didn't improve dramatically. Tom sat in his kitchen that evening, staring at a pile of unpaid bills spread across the table. The numbers didn't add up no matter how many times he rearranged them. Feed bills, equipment repairs, fuel costs, insurance payments, and the ever-present mortgage payment created a mountain of debt that seemed impossible to climb. He thought about calling his sisters, but he knew they had their own financial struggles in the city. Besides, he felt ashamed that he couldn't manage to keep the family ranch running when his parents had somehow made it work for decades. What Tom didn't know was that his parents had faced similar struggles multiple times over the years. There had been droughts, market crashes, and periods when they'd barely had enough money for groceries. But they'd persevered through careful planning, hard work, and the gradual accumulation of the savings that Margaret was now preparing to use. Back at Sunset Manor, Margaret spent her evenings going through old photo albums and letters, remembering the early days when she and her husband had worked 16-hour days to build their life together. She remembered the year they'd almost lost everything to a failed wheat crop, and how they'd slowly rebuilt by diversifying their investments and always putting aside a little money, even when times were tough. She also remembered Tom as a young boy following his father around the ranch, eager to learn and help with any task. He'd grown into a good man, hard-working and honest, but he'd inherited the ranch during one of the most challenging periods in agricultural history. Commodity prices were volatile, environmental challenges were increasing, and small family farms were struggling to compete with large corporate operations. Margaret made her decision. She instructed Harold to begin the process of converting her assets into cash, but she had specific requirements about how the money would be delivered to Tom. She wanted it to appear as if help was coming from an external source, perhaps a grant program or an anonymous benefactor, anything that would allow Tom to accept the help without feeling like he was taking charity from his elderly mother. Harold worked through the legal complexities, preparing documents that would facilitate the transfer while protecting Margaret's identity. It was an unusual request, but he'd learned over the years that family dynamics around money could be complicated, and sometimes the most generous acts required the most careful planning. The process of liquidating decades' worth of investments proved more complex than Margaret had anticipated. Harold explained that converting such a large amount of money into cash would take several weeks and required careful coordination with multiple financial institutions. Some of the bonds and certificates of deposit had specific maturity dates, while others carried penalties for early withdrawal that had to be weighed against the urgency of Tom's situation. Margaret spent her days at Sunset Manor fielding phone calls from various banks and investment firms, each requiring verification of her identity and authorization for the transfers. The staff at the facility began to notice that the quiet elderly woman in room 14B seemed to spend an unusual amount of time on financial phone calls, but they assumed she was simply managing routine retirement affairs. During this time, Tom's situation grew increasingly desperate. The bank had officially begun foreclosure proceedings, and he had received a notice that he had 30 days to bring his mortgage current or lose the ranch. The amount needed was substantial, not just the back payments, but also penalties and legal fees that had accumulated. Tom made the difficult decision to start selling off livestock to raise cash. Each animal sold represented years of careful breeding and herd management, but he had no choice. The cattle market was particularly poor that season, which meant he was getting far less than the animals were worth, but any cash was better than none. His neighbor, Bill Crawford, stopped by one afternoon and found Tom loading cattle into a transport truck. Bill had known the Wilson family for over 40 years and could see the strain on Tom's face. The two men stood by the fence watching the cattle truck disappear down the dirt road, and Bill could tell that Tom was fighting back tears. Bill offered to help however he could, but both men knew that neighboring ranchers were all facing similar challenges. The entire agricultural community in their area was struggling with the same combination of drought, low commodity prices, and high operating costs that was threatening Tom's ranch. Meanwhile, Margaret had successfully liquidated most of her investments and now had the cash sitting in a money market account. The final amount was even higher than she'd initially calculated, due to some investments that had performed better than expected. Harold had prepared a complex legal structure that would allow the money to be dispersed to Tom through what appeared to be an agricultural assistance foundation. The plan was elaborate but necessary. Harold had connections with a legitimate agricultural nonprofit that provided emergency assistance to family farms. They agreed to act as a conduit for Margaret's gift, making it appear as if Tom had been selected for a special hardship grant program. The paperwork made it look like he'd been chosen from a pool of applicants, though of course he'd never actually applied. Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as the plan moved forward. She'd never been involved in anything this deceptive, even though her motives were purely generous. She worried that Tom might somehow discover the truth and feel embarrassed or angry, that she'd been hiding her financial situation from him. The physical logistics of moving such a large amount of money also presented challenges. While most modern transfers could be handled electronically, Margaret had insisted on maintaining some cash reserves that she could access immediately if needed. This meant that her famous leather suitcase, which Tom had helped carry to Sunset Manor weeks earlier, now contained far more than anyone could have imagined. Harold had advised against keeping such a large amount of cash, explaining the risks and the reporting requirements that came with moving that much money. But Margaret was adamant that she wanted to maintain control over at least a portion of the funds. She'd grown up during the Great Depression, when banks failed and people lost everything overnight, and she'd never completely trusted institutions with all of her money. The suitcase now contained nearly $400,000 in carefully organized stacks of bills. Margaret had requested the money in various denominations to make it less conspicuous, and she'd hidden it beneath her clothing and personal items, just as she'd done with smaller amounts for years. Tom received the call on a Thursday morning, while he was fixing a water pipe that had frozen and burst during the night. Harold's voice on the phone was professional and formal, as he explained that Tom had been selected to receive an emergency agricultural assistance grant. The amount was substantial enough to cover his immediate debts and provide working capital to get through the next growing season. Tom's first reaction was disbelief. He'd never applied for any grants, and he couldn't understand why he'd been chosen. Harold explained that the selection had been based on various factors, including his family's long history in agriculture, his commitment to sustainable farming practices, and his status as a young farmer trying to maintain a family operation. The requirements were minimal. Tom would need to provide documentation of his debts and agree to use the money specifically for ranch operations and debt relief. There were no requirements for repayment, though the grant did come with some basic reporting requirements about how the money was used. Tom hung up the phone feeling like he'd been given a second chance at life. The amount Harold had mentioned would not only save the ranch but provide enough working capital to make necessary improvements and investments that could help ensure long-term success. That evening, Tom drove to Sunset Manor to share the incredible news with his mother. He found Margaret in the common room, playing cards with some of the other residents. When he told her about the grant, she managed to look appropriately surprised and pleased, though inside she felt a deep satisfaction at seeing the relief and hope return to her son's eyes. As they talked about his plans for the ranch, Margaret offered gentle suggestions about how he might use the money most effectively. Her insights were surprisingly sophisticated, reflecting years of experience managing agricultural finances, though Tom attributed her wisdom to the general knowledge that came from a lifetime of farm living. The transformation of Tom's ranch over the following months was remarkable. With the grant money, he was able to pay off all his debts, repair and upgrade essential equipment, and invest in improvements that had been needed for years. He installed a new irrigation system that would help protect against future droughts, repaired all the fencing, and purchased high-quality breeding stock to improve his herd. What impressed everyone who knew Tom was how carefully and strategically he used every dollar, rather than splurging on unnecessary equipment or taking a vacation after years of stress. He approached each expenditure with the same careful consideration his parents had taught him. He consulted with agricultural extension agents, researched the best suppliers, and made decisions based on long-term value rather than immediate convenience. Margaret watched her son's progress with quiet pride during their regular visits. The change in his demeanor was dramatic. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, his shoulders no longer carried the weight of impending disaster, and he spoke about the future with optimism rather than dread. But keeping her secret was becoming increasingly difficult. Harold had handled the legal aspects of the grant perfectly, and there was no reason for Tom to suspect that the money had come from his mother. However, Margaret found herself having to be careful about the financial advice she offered and the knowledge she displayed about ranching economics. During one visit, Tom mentioned that he was considering diversifying into organic beef production, which could command premium prices in certain markets. Margaret's immediate response revealed far more knowledge about organic certification processes, market trends, and profit margins than a typical elderly woman might be expected to possess. Tom gave her a curious look, but Margaret quickly changed the subject. The truth was that Margaret had been researching agricultural markets and investment opportunities for decades. She'd subscribed to farming journals, attended agricultural conferences when possible, and maintained relationships with extension agents and other experts in the field. Her financial success hadn't been based on luck, but on informed decision-making and careful attention to market conditions. As Tom's ranch continued to thrive, he began to attract attention from other farmers in the area who were struggling with similar challenges. Word had spread about the mysterious grant that had saved the Wilson Ranch, and several neighbors approached Tom asking for advice about finding similar assistance programs. Tom felt uncomfortable with this attention because he still didn't fully understand why he'd been selected for the grant. He'd tried to research the agricultural foundation that had provided the money, but the information available was limited. Harold had explained that many such foundations preferred to maintain privacy to avoid being overwhelmed with applications, which seemed reasonable, but left Tom feeling like there was something he wasn't understanding about the situation. Meanwhile, Margaret was dealing with her own challenges at Sunset Manor. The facility's financial counselor had noticed some unusual activity in Margaret's accounts and wanted to discuss her financial management. It was routine for the facility to monitor residents' finances to ensure they could continue to afford the care, but Margaret's situation was far from typical. The counselor, a well-meaning woman named Patricia, suggested that Margaret might want to consider more conservative investments given her age. She'd noticed the large transfers and liquidations from Margaret's accounts and was concerned that someone might be taking advantage of an elderly woman. Patricia's intentions were good, but Margaret found the scrutiny stressful. Margaret had to carefully explain some of her financial activities without revealing the full extent of her wealth or the fact that she'd been helping her son. She spoke in general terms about restructuring her investments and preparing for future care needs, which was technically true even if it wasn't the complete story. The situation became more complicated when Tom mentioned to Margaret that he'd been approached by a local journalist who was interested in writing a story about small family farms that had managed to overcome financial difficulties through grant programs. The journalist had heard about Tom's success and wanted to feature his story as an example of how agricultural assistance programs could make a difference. Tom was hesitant about the publicity, but he also recognized that the story might help other farmers learn about available resources. Margaret felt a surge of panic at the thought of journalists investigating the grant, but she tried to remain calm as she discussed the situation with her son. She gently suggested that he might want to be cautious about publicity, explaining that sometimes attention could lead to unwanted complications. She mentioned that other family members, meaning his sisters, might have opinions about the ranch's business being discussed publicly. Tom considered her advice and ultimately decided to decline the interview, much to Margaret's relief. But the close call made Margaret realize that her secret might not remain hidden indefinitely. The agricultural community was relatively small, and people talked. If someone decided to investigate the grant more thoroughly, the truth might come to light. Harold had warned her about this possibility from the beginning. While the legal structure they'd created was sound, it wouldn't withstand intense scrutiny from someone determined to trace the money to its source. Margaret began to consider whether it might be time to tell Tom the truth. The decision became more urgent when Tom announced during one of their visits that he was planning to expand his operation significantly. The success of the past year had given him confidence, and he was considering purchasing additional land from a neighboring rancher who was looking to retire. The purchase would require a substantial investment, and Tom was planning to approach banks for financing. He was confident that his improved financial situation and the success of his recent operations would make him an attractive borrower. But Margaret knew that any detailed financial review might raise questions about the original grant that had made his turnaround possible. That night, Margaret sat in her small room at Sunset Manor, looking at the leather suitcase that still contained hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. She'd kept the money available partly out of habit and partly because she wanted to be prepared to help Tom again if needed. But now she realized that the secret was becoming a burden rather than a gift. She made a decision that would change everything between her and her son, but she needed to find the right way to tell him the truth without making him feel embarrassed or angry about the deception. Margaret spent several sleepless nights planning how to reveal the truth to Tom. She knew that timing would be crucial, and she wanted to find a way to explain her deception without diminishing the pride he felt in his ranch's recovery. The conversation would need to happen somewhere private, where they could talk openly without interruption. She decided to invite Tom for Sunday dinner in the private dining room that Sunset Manor made available for family visits. Margaret rarely used this space, preferring the casual atmosphere of her own room. But this conversation required a more formal setting. She asked Tom to bring some of his business records, explaining that she wanted to understand more about how the ranch was doing. Tom arrived that Sunday afternoon with a folder full of financial statements, profit and loss reports, and plans for the expansion he was considering. He was excited to share the details with his mother, proud of how he'd managed to turn the operation around. The ranch was now profitable, his debts were manageable, and he had real plans for growth. As they sat down to eat, Margaret listened carefully as Tom explained his vision for the expanded operation. His plans were sound and well-researched. He'd learned from the near disaster of the previous year and was approaching growth more strategically this time. But when he mentioned his plans to secure financing for the land purchase, Margaret knew she couldn't wait any longer. She excused herself briefly and returned to the dining room carrying her leather suitcase. Tom looked puzzled as his mother set the case on the table beside their dinner plates. It was the same suitcase he'd helped her pack months ago when she moved to Sunset Manor, but something about the way she handled it suggested it contained more than just clothes and personal items. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened the suitcase. Tom's eyes widened as he saw stacks of carefully organized cash, more money than he'd ever seen in one place. Before he could ask questions, Margaret began to speak in a voice that was steadier than she felt. She told him everything, the decades of careful saving and investing that he'd never known about, the financial planning she and his father had done together, always with the intention of protecting their family's future, the investments that had grown beyond their wildest expectations through careful management and patience. Tom sat in stunned silence as his mother explained how she'd been managing a substantial portfolio for years, making decisions about stocks, bonds, and other investments with the same careful attention she'd once given to managing household expenses. She'd educated herself about finance, consulted with advisors, and gradually built wealth that she'd kept hidden to protect the family from the complications that sudden money could bring. The hardest part of the conversation came when Margaret explained about the grant. She told Tom about watching him struggle, about the sleepless nights when she'd known she had the resources to help, but wasn't sure how to offer them without damaging his pride. She explained how she and Harold had created the Agricultural Foundation arrangement, not to deceive him but to give him the help he needed in a way he could accept. Tom's reaction went through several stages. First was disbelief, then confusion, followed by a flash of anger at being deceived. He stood up from the table and walked to the window, trying to process what his mother had told him. The ranch's recovery, which he'd attributed to his own hard work and a stroke of luck, was actually the result of his mother's generosity and years of financial planning. Margaret watched her son's face, seeing the struggle between gratitude and wounded pride. She understood his reaction because she'd anticipated it. In many ways, this was exactly why she'd kept the money secret for so long. She'd seen how money could complicate family relationships, how gifts could become sources of resentment rather than joy. After several minutes of silence, Tom returned to the table and asked the practical questions that were flooding his mind. How much money were they actually talking about? How long had she been planning this? Did his sisters know? What did this mean for his plans to expand the ranch? Margaret answered each question honestly. The total amount of her assets was larger than the money she'd already given him. His sisters knew nothing about the money, and she'd planned to handle their inheritance separately when the time came. As for his expansion plans, she wanted to support them if they made financial sense, but she also wanted him to understand that the money came with responsibilities. The conversation continued late into the evening. Tom gradually moved from shock and hurt feelings to a deeper understanding of what his mother had accomplished. She'd taken the modest savings of a farming family and turned them into generational wealth through decades of careful planning. More importantly, she'd found a way to use that wealth to save something that mattered deeply to both of them, the family ranch. By the end of the evening, Tom's predominant emotion was gratitude, though it was mixed with amazement at his mother's financial acumen and a certain amount of embarrassment that he'd never realized how much she understood about money and business. He'd always thought of her as the supportive farm wife who'd helped his father, but now he realized she'd been an equal partner in building not just the ranch, but the financial foundation that had secured their family's future. Margaret felt an enormous sense of relief as they talked. Keeping the secret had been more stressful than she'd realized, and being able to speak openly about her financial knowledge and experience was liberating. She'd spent years downplaying her understanding of business and investment matters, partly out of habit, and partly because it hadn't seemed important for others to know. As Tom prepared to leave that evening, he looked at the suitcase still sitting, open on the table. The sight of so much cash was overwhelming, but what struck him most was the realization of how much trust his mother was placing in him. She was essentially turning over the financial security she'd spent decades building, trusting that he would use it wisely and protect the family's future. Margaret closed the suitcase and handed it to Tom. She explained that while she'd liquidated most of her investments to help with the ranch, she'd kept this cash available for immediate needs and future opportunities. She wanted him to understand that the money wasn't just a gift, but an investment in the ranch's future and the continuation of everything his father had worked to build. The drive back to the ranch that night was unlike any Tom had ever experienced. The leather suitcase sat on the passenger seat beside him, containing more money than most people would see in a lifetime. But more than the money itself, Tom was carrying the weight of understanding who his mother really was, and the depth of her love and sacrifice for their family. The weeks following Margaret's revelation marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between mother and son. Tom found himself seeking his mother's advice on financial and business matters with a new respect for her expertise. What had once seemed like casual suggestions from a caring parent were now recognized as insights from someone with decades of investment experience and business acumen. Tom's expansion plans moved forward with Margaret as an active partner rather than just a supportive observer. Together, they analyzed the potential land purchase, evaluating not just the agricultural value, but also the long-term investment potential. Margaret's questions were sophisticated and probing, reflecting her understanding of market trends, risk assessment, and strategic planning. The neighboring rancher, Bill Crawford, had been surprised by Tom's ability to move forward with the land purchase so quickly. The price was substantial, and most young ranchers would have needed months or years to secure financing from banks. When Tom paid in cash, it generated considerable curiosity in the local agricultural community. Tom found himself in the unusual position of having to deflect questions about his family's financial situation while learning to work with resources he'd never imagined having access to. Margaret coached him on the importance of discretion, sharing lessons she'd learned over the years about how to manage wealth without attracting unwanted attention or creating problems with neighbors and business associates. The expanded ranch operation exceeded everyone's expectations. With Margaret's financial backing, Tom was able to implement improvements and strategies that would have been impossible under his previous circumstances. He invested in sustainable technologies, improved breeding programs, and diversification strategies that positioned the ranch for long-term success regardless of market fluctuations. But perhaps more importantly, the experience of working together gave both Tom and Margaret a new appreciation for each other's capabilities. Tom gained respect for his mother's business intelligence and strategic thinking, while Margaret took pride in seeing her son apply the lessons he'd learned from years of struggle to build something truly successful. The secret of Margaret's wealth remained closely held within the family. Harold continued to provide legal and financial advice, helping them structure their affairs to minimize tax implications and ensure proper succession planning. The agricultural foundation that had served as a conduit for the initial assistance was quietly dissolved, having served its purpose. Margaret's living situation at Sunset Manor also evolved. With her financial situation now openly acknowledged, she was able to upgrade to a larger suite and take advantage of additional services. But more importantly, she no longer felt the need to hide her financial sophistication from the staff and other residents. She began offering informal financial advice to other residents who were struggling with retirement planning or family financial issues. Her reputation as someone who understood money and investing gradually spread throughout the facility, and Margaret found herself enjoying the role of mentor and advisor. Tom's sisters eventually learned about the family's changed financial circumstances when Margaret decided it was time to update her estate planning. The revelation led to some difficult conversations, as both daughters struggled with feelings of having been left out of the secret and concerns about fairness in the distribution of the family wealth. Margaret handled these discussions with the same careful planning she'd brought to her financial management. She explained her reasoning for helping Tom first, emphasizing that the ranch represented not just his livelihood, but a preservation of the family's heritage. She also outlined her plans for ensuring that all her children would be provided for, though in different ways that reflected their different circumstances and needs. The ranch continued to thrive under Tom's management, with Margaret's ongoing involvement as both advisor and partner. They developed a formal business relationship that acknowledged Margaret's financial contribution while respecting Tom's role as the day-to-day operator. The arrangement served as a model for how family wealth could be used to strengthen rather than complicate family relationships. Years later, when agricultural journalists and business writers began to take notice of the Wilson Ranch's remarkable turnaround and continued success, Tom and Margaret had developed a carefully crafted story that acknowledged the role of family financial planning and generational wealth transfer, without revealing the specific details of Margaret's secret fortune. The leather suitcase, now empty, of its cash contents was retired to a place of honor in Tom's home office. It served as a reminder not just of the money that had saved the ranch, but of the love, sacrifice, and careful planning that had made that salvation possible. Margaret lived to see the ranch become one of the most successful operations in the region, a model of sustainable agriculture and sound business practices. She took pride in knowing that her decades of careful financial management had not only preserved the family legacy, but had enabled it to flourish in ways that even she had never fully imagined. The story of the rancher who sent his mother away, never knowing she carried $1.4 million in her suitcase, became a family legend passed down to future generations. But the real story was about something more valuable than money. The power of unconditional love, the importance of planning for the future, and the way that true generosity can transform not just financial circumstances, but the entire trajectory of a family's destiny. Tom often reflected on how close he had come to losing everything, not just the ranch, but the opportunity to truly understand and appreciate the remarkable woman who had raised him. Margaret's secret had been more than just hidden money. It had been hidden wisdom, hidden strength, and a hidden demonstration of love that was willing to sacrifice anything to protect what mattered most.